As we've seen in the first two programs, by the end of the 18th century, atheism had finally emerged in France. But it was more or less confined to the educated and the privileged. There was as yet no open expression of plebeian doubt. And yet over the next 200 years, atheism would begin to infiltrate the lives of ordinary people, and the once obedient piety of the working class would undergo a radical transformation. So how did that happen? In 1790, the Parisian aristocrat Paul-Henri Thierry, the Baron d'Holbach, wrote a book that was so openly atheistic and so provocative that the French authorities, not content with banning it, had it publicly burned by the official executioner.
It is only by dispelling the clouds and phantoms of religion that we shall discover truth, reason, and morality.
The Baron d'Holbach is widely referred to as the Newton of the atheists. His book, The System of Nature, is often accepted as the first openly and avowedly atheist work in European scholarship. And yet he wasn't quite as bold as that suggests. After all, the book was published under an assumed name. Atheism, it seems, even when it finally emerged, was not yet quite a safe idea. In England, the intellectual elite didn't even go as far as that. They weren't atheists exactly, but deists. That's to say, they didn't deny the existence of God. They were perfectly happy to reconstruct Christianity and reduce the deity to some distant first cause. And to be on the safe side, what the intellectual aristocrats did was not to talk about it in front of the servants. Religion was far too intricately bound up with the fabric of political authority and social hierarchy. Indeed, it was an essential ingredient in the maintenance of the privileged life which the elite themselves enjoyed. To undermine the religious faith of the masses would be both politically dangerous and perhaps socially suicidal. And yet, this could not, and indeed it didn't last. By the end of the 18th century, a more popular, and some would say more subversive form of skepticism began to appear. And although, to begin with, it didn't take the form of explicit atheism, the argumentative deism of lower middle-class publicists such as Thomas Paine set the stage for a much more radical form of religious skepticism. One which, in England at least, was to find itself in almost unremitting conflict with the political and legal establishment.
Of all the tyrannies that afflict mankind, tyranny in religion is the worst. Every other species of tyranny is limited to the world we live in, but this attempts a stride beyond the grave and seeks to pursue us into eternity.
It's no exaggeration to say that Thomas Paine was one of the most influential thinkers that England has ever produced. But his sceptical attitude, his deism, was profoundly different from that of the privileged classes in which deism had originally been born. He was a self-taught philosopher who had not benefited from a university education. The revolutionary impact of his ideas has been studied by the Cambridge historian Simon Schaffer.
What I think is so striking is that a lot of the relatively elite intellectual response to the appearance of plebeian unbelief in cheap print is not so much that these are false arguments, but that they're dangerous arguments. since it's agreed on all hands that knowledge is power, giving power and giving the power of materialism and naturalism to large sectors of the labouring classes was judged to be very dangerous. And one does see in the 1820s in England, for example, folk who are, as it were, elite atheists, who argue that there is no rational evidence for the existence of God, that you don't have to ground morality on faith in God's existence, but that it would be socially fatal for everybody to know that. There's a sense in which there's always been a social heft to the debate about atheism in Britain. That there are ideas it's safe to contemplate, but not safe to publish and make widely available.
All churches, whether Jewish, Christian or Muslim, appear to me no other than human inventions set up to terrify and enslave mankind and to monopolize power and profit.
It's not altogether surprising that the first and most enthusiastic people to embrace Tom Paine were the dissatisfied colonists in North America. Paine's eloquent advocacy of independence proved to be inspirational, and it was he who first coined the phrase that dignified their revolutionary ambitions, the United States of America. Paine abandoned his English home and went to live in America, and the first rare editions of some of his most influential early works can be found in this New England Museum. It's interesting when you look at this first edition of Common Sense, which, as you see on the title page, is addressed to the inhabitants of America. Even in the first paragraphs, when he's addressing himself to the problems of society, there are already expressions of the principles which stimulate him to criticize the authority of the church. Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. Now, that distinction really applies to what he later says in The Age of Reason about the authority of the church. Almost everywhere in The Age of Reason, he attacks orthodox beliefs and encourages people to develop their own rationality, their own moral sensibilities, and their natural ability to interact morally with one another, contrary to what the monarchical and indeed the ecclesiastical authorities thought, that without the church, without government, man would become wicked and return to his animal nature.
It is from the Bible that man has learned cruelty, rapine and murder. For the belief in a cruel God makes a cruel man, and the Bible is a history of wickedness that has served to corrupt and brutalize mankind.
Here he was, what the upper classes would have called a common man. But he's expressing what all men have in common, which is much more interesting.
The most detestable wickedness, the most horrid cruelties and the greatest miseries that have afflicted the human race have had their origin in this thing called religion.
As soon as the Americans had succeeded in establishing their independence, they were eager to show their gratitude to the English radical who had helped to inspire them. In 1776, the estate on which the original house over there once stood was commandeered by the state of New York and taken from someone who had been a loyalist to the British during the War of Independence. And in 1784, it was given to Thomas Paine in recognition of his services to the American Revolution.